In this lesson, I'm going to explain the logic behind my pad setup and what I call the acoustic drum model. Hi, my name is Dragon from Dragon Finger Drums, and I'm here to teach you how to play finger drums like a real drummer. If you want to learn the secrets to realistic drumming on the pads, make sure you don't miss out on my free finger drumming starter course. You can get it by clicking the link in the video description or the pinned comment down below. So for the most realistic acoustic style finger drumming possible, we want to set up our pads so that we can maximize our hand and finger isolation. That's ultimately what playing a drum kit, as opposed to a single drum with your hands or drumsticks, that's what playing a drum kit is about. It's about isolation. You have multiple limbs that are working on playing basically one instrument, which is really a collection of instruments, cymbals and multiple drums. And you want all of your limbs to be able to isolate from each other to still pull off grouped rhythms. So it sounds like one rhythm is being played, but you're actually doing maybe 4 different things at once. And it's the same for finger drumming. We have 10 fingers to work with rather than just 4 limbs. We don't actually need to use all 10 of our fingers, but we have them available to us. And so when we're working with this layout, this setup of 16 pads, we want to set it up in a way that allows our fingers and our hands to isolate from each other, because that allows for maximum versatility. If you have your pads set up in a way that, for example, anytime you want to hit the kick or the snare or the hi-hat, it's all on one hand, it's all on just a couple fingers to do that, you're not going to be able to isolate those elements from each other. I see a lot of finger drummers set up their pads like that. They'll put, whichever hand it is, they'll put kick, snare, and hat right next to each other, and they'll try to play them with these 3 fingers, like this. That doesn't work. You can do very simple beats like that, but you cannot play complicated beats like that because you won't be able to isolate your hi-hat enough from your kick, from your snare. If you want to do complex ghost notes on your snare drum and like a double kick drum pattern and 16th notes on your hi-hat with some rests, it's way too complicated for 3 fingers to be able to do like that. So you actually want to emulate an acoustic drummer in keeping your limbs isolated from each other so that they can play the most versatile possible rhythms. So what we want to do when setting up our pads, and this is the best explanation for my pad setup, is to visualize an acoustic drum kit. I'll put up a picture here so you can see just an overhead picture of an acoustic drum kit. They're all set up pretty much the same way. Whenever you go to a concert and see a drum kit set up, they almost all set them up the same way, almost all drummers. Now, why is this? It's because they've developed over 100 years of the drum kit being in existence. Standards have developed. Drummers have figured out that this is more or less the best way to set up your drum kit. There are definitely drummers out there who make exceptions and they change things around a little bit, but more or less, this is the essential drumming setup. Now, looking at that overhead and going back here to an overhead of our pads, keeping that visualization in mind, the snare drum is directly in front of the drummer. Their legs are usually around the snare drum and it's sitting right in front of them. So for us, on our fingers, pads 2 and 6 are our main snare drum hits. So that makes sense because they're sort of right in the middle here. The hi-hat is on the non-dominant side. So for right-handed drummers, it's on the left, and for left-handed drummers, it's usually on their right. Now the reason for this is the elevation difference between the snare drum and the hi-hat. So if a drummer is right-handed, for example, they can use their left hand to play the snare drum, and their right hand can actually sit over their left hand and play the hi-hat. And this is literally because of the physical elevation. Now we don't have that elevation, so we can't have those 2 elements crossed over from each other if we want to play the hi-hat with our dominant hand and the snare drum with our non-dominant hand, which I think we should to get the most realistic drumming experience. So we actually want our hi-hats to be on our dominant side because we don't have that elevation factor. So that's why the closed hi-hats and the open hi-hat here are all on my dominant side. The same thing goes for the ride cymbal up here, 15 and 16. These pads up here are both the ride cymbal, and that is because a drummer plays the ride cymbal with their dominant hand, the same as the hi-hat. So we want to think about these things and make sure that we're emulating what a drummer is doing in addition to visualizing their setup so that we can get the most versatile and accurate finger drumming possible. So we have our snare right in front of us. We have our hi-hat normally crossed over for elevation, but on our dominant side now on the pads. We have our ride, which is the same sort of thing on our dominant side. This number 7 pad is a side stick, which is a variation of the snare. So basically, all 3 of these pads are snare drums. All 3 of these pads are hi-hats, and both of these pads are rides. Okay, so the kick drum is a different topic, which is kind of interesting because as finger drummers, we don't have feet to work with. We need to put everything on our hands. So we basically, for this factor, we ignore what would normally be an acoustic drumming visual layout because there's just no way to copy it because we're using our hands for everything. We're not using our feet at all. So for the kick, when it comes to determining where to put this, what hand to play it with, I find that playing the kick with the non-dominant hand, the same hand that plays the snare, I find that this is ideal. Because if you listen to a lot of drumming, the kick and the snare usually aren't competing with each other. They aren't playing a lot of the same notes because they're both strong, punchy sort of accent sounds. So they actually play off of each other most commonly. Whereas the hi-hat or the ride cymbal, these are used to keep the backbeat, which means they're playing very steadily and consistently. Usually, there are always exceptions to this, but in general. So to have our dominant hand focused on playing those backbeats, whether it's on the hi-hat or the ride, just like a real drummer would, and then to have our non-dominant hand, which normally is playing accents on the snare, to also give it the job of playing accents on the kick, it's totally fine and it works very well. Now the reason I have 2 kick drums here is so that I can play double kick drums if I want to do a really fast fill with my kicks. So instead of just having the most common finger drumming setup is your kick on pad 1, your snare on pad 2, and your hi-hat on pad 3. I do have that, but pads 1 and 2 are actually less commonly used variations of the kick and the snare that I'm not hitting all the time. I actually keep my non-dominant hand resting up here on pads 5 and 6. Now the reason for this in particular is because the rim shot on pad 6 is much punchier sounding than the normal snare hit or the snare open hit on pad 2. So I actually use pad 2 when I want to do some more subtle snare hits. It still has a full dynamic range, so I can play it very loudly, but when I want to do ghost notes or a lot of snare fill notes, I will go to pad 2. For my accents on the snare, my typical snare hits that are sort of keeping the rhythm, I use pad 6, which is the rim shot. And this is actually a very common technique in jazz drumming, where if you listen, a lot of those little fill notes, those ghost notes will be played with very light snare hits. And then when the drummer wants to play an accent note on the snare to accentuate the backbeat, they use a rim shot. They hit the rim too, because it's a much punchier sound. So you don't even need to use much stronger dynamics to get an automatic contrast between the punchiness of this rim shot and the softness of this snare hit. So that's sort of the reasoning behind these bottom 2 rows here. You know, I have kicks here for when I want to do double kicks. Normally I'm resting like this, kick and snare on the non-dominant hand, and my dominant hand is playing the hi-hat, and I can go to the open hi-hat up here just like an acoustic drummer. Now, the topic of exactly how to place my fingers and when to place them, don't worry if it feels like I'm skipping that. The next few lessons are about fingering, and that's exactly what that is. So I'm going to explain in detail how and when and why to place your fingers, but I'm just explaining the logic behind this layout in this lesson. So now the 3rd row is just my tom row. It's all toms. If we go back to that acoustic drum kit visualization, the snare drum is directly in front of the drummer, and the toms are kind of spread out. You know, so if a drummer does a fill or a roll up the snare and down the toms, he goes from, you know, snare drum to tom, down, 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 and then he can go back to the snare. So we've kind of emulated that here in the finger drums, where we can roll up our snare and down, down, down our toms and back to our snare. We obviously have a much smaller space we're working in, so the distance is not as big of a deal, but it's the same visual sort of layout, and it just makes sense for realistic drumming. Now we've already covered the ride cymbals up here. We want them on the same side as our hi-hat. And the reason why they're not farther down is because of this tom row. It's really good to have that all blocked out here for all of your drums. So having the rides up here is totally fine and works pretty ideally. And then up here, 13 and 14 pads are just crash cymbals. You can put splash cymbals here or China cymbals or other effects, like whatever else you want to put here. You could put a gong, you know, anything like that. But these are just generally my lesser used effects hits. But again, there's still sort of that visualization logic there because the leftmost crash is the one that actually sounds on the left side of the drum kit. It's panned to the left, and the rightmost crash is panned to the right. So we still are thinking in terms of that physical, visual, acoustic layout. So one great thing you can do to get sort of more into this pad layout and start thinking more about it is to watch videos of acoustic drummers playing. Literally just watch their hands, watch their limbs, watch how they move, and start connecting what you're hearing to what they're doing physically. And that will give you a much better overview and understanding of the logic of this layout, and maybe even how you could make your own adjustments and make a layout that works possibly even better for you. So there is no perfect right answer for pad layout. It's going to depend on each person, but I think the acoustic visualization drum model and setting it up so that our hands and our fingers can be as isolated as possible while still working in tandem together, I think that is the best starting point for anyone wanting to do realistic finger drumming, because we're concerned with versatility, being able to play a lot of different types of beats, and realism. We want it to feel and look more real, like we're actually drumming. So that is the basis of the logic behind my acoustic drum kit model.